Hello, everyone, and welcome to Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering and eternal commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. If, dear friend, you find the conversations on this channel enlightening, entertaining, insightful, soothing to the ear, or nourishing to the soul, please do consider subscribing to this channel. We'd be more than happy for you to join our growing community of philosophers, of lovers of wisdom, of lovers of great conversation, among whom I can tell you most certainly belong. For content specific to wellness, philosophy, meditation, and sleep, you can, of course, visit my sister project, Numa, by Daniel Finneran, to which I'll include a link below, and it's available on YouTube and all the usual podcast streaming services. My guest today, with whom I'm absolutely honored and delighted to have the opportunity to chat, is Dr. James Charney. Dr. Charney is not unlike the recent string of superb guests I've been lucky enough to meet and host on this channel. A diversely talented, highly educated, and widely accomplished man. A psychiatrist by training, Dr. Charney has since his boyhood, upon which he reflects most tenderly in the introduction to his most recent book, nurtured a strong affinity for film. Dr. Charney attended the prestigious Columbia University, at which, while an English major, he enrolled in the school's very first film history class. A victim, perhaps, of the uncertain career prospects by which every English major is at some point along the course of his academic journey haunted, Dr. Charney declared himself pre-med. He went on to obtain his medical degree from Duke University. While practicing as a clinician, he took a teaching post at Yale University, where he introduced a course entitled Madness at the Movies, the very same title that his new book bears, of which I purchased myself a copy, and of which I urge you to purchase yourself a copy. Dr. Charney, thank you so very much for joining me today.
I'm delighted to be here, Daniel, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you developed quite early in life something more than a childish affinity for film. You seem to have taken to the theater enthusiastically at that very young age. Can you recall your first or most impressionable experience at the theater? And if so, what was that like?
I cannot at all recall my first experience seeing movies, but the most impressionable one fits in very well with something that I've been working on quite recently, which was seeing a couple of horror movies as a young kid that probably permanently damaged my psyche. But back in the day, and this is a long time ago because I'm pretty old, movies cost about 25 cents. And the local movie theater would have a double feature. And the double features were also coupled with shorts, cartoons, documentaries, newsreels. And so you can have an entire afternoon's movie experience. You'd often go with some friends. And it, of course, gave your folks an entire afternoon separate and free of you. So it was a very common thing for them to drop us off, and we'd watch a double feature. And unfortunately, one time I saw a double feature of two horror movies. One was the movie Them, which is a story about giant ants that are created out of the radioactivity from nuclear testing. In the 1950s, this was very much a subject of movies because the atomic bomb was very scary. So these giant ants were terrorizing the Southwest and then parts of California. And what I remember most about that was the brilliance. One of the things that was an absolute pleasure for me was to discover as an adult, watching the movie Them and deciding that if I'm going to have a traumatic movie experience, it might as well be with a good movie. Because it's very easy to have a traumatic experience with a mediocre one when you're young enough. And it turns out this is a really well done film. It stars James Arness, who later became famous on television for one of the early popular westerns called Gunsmoke. But what was wonderful about this film was the way it made you terrorized before you ever saw the monster. And what it did was that when they discovered a few dead bodies, they smelled a smell that they identified as formaldehyde. And what would happen next in the film was the whiff of formaldehyde would portend that the monster was approaching. Because it turns out that formaldehyde is indeed a chemical that ants use when they are killing their prey. But when the prey is a human being and the ant is a giant ant, then we're in trouble. So anyway, this movie scared the heck out of me, and I have to say I watched most of it behind my hands like this. But I made the mistake of watching it twice because what happened was that my mom forgot to pick us up, and so I stayed. And by the way, the second movie was a really mediocre horror film called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And what made it mediocre, unlike them, which was so good at suggesting the horror before it showed it, you didn't actually see one of these giant ants until well past the halfway point of the film. What made The Creature of the Black Lagoon so mediocre was it was basically it had a costume that even an 8-year-old could look at and say, "This is really silly." But I wound up watching them twice, and I had bad dreams for weeks after that. And I never let my mom forget that she allowed me to be overexposed to this scary movie. So that is my first early memory. On the other hand, my family had a wonderful tradition of going to see movies as a family, and often they were the event movies that would be in the big city. So the kind of film where you'd have to get tickets in advance, the Ten Commandments, Around the World in 80 Days, Cinerama movies where the screen was almost probably 180 degrees. It totally encapsulated your field of vision and really pulled you in. It was in the days when the movies were running scared because everyone was watching television, and so the movies had to do something to make it worthwhile for you to leave your living room and go into a theater. And what they did is they got bigger and they were in color because back then television was still all in black and white. So whatever they could do to encourage you to consider movies special and worth paying a little extra for. Back then, the event movies weren't 25 cents, they were $1.50. This was significantly more expensive. Anyway, so that was a wonderful family experience that we would have. Back then, if you went to one of those movies, there would even have brochures, like a playbill that you would get in the theater to go to see a movie. And if the movie was really grand, like Around the World in 80 Days, and ran for more than 3 hours, there was even an intermission. So it was kind of recreating the experience of live theater, but seeing a film. And I remember that fondly because it also was an opportunity to go into New York City and go to a favorite restaurant and feel very grown up.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You speak about the way in which television was at that time rising and threatening the film industry. And I think we see something very similar today, where the streaming services especially, and if not television on its own, are producing really high quality content. And people no longer have to go outside their own homes to find this wonderful content. They can simply turn on a laptop computer and watch or their television and watch a series like Breaking Bad on I think it was on AMC.
It was on AMC, yes.
And yeah, and no longer do you have to venture out to the theater and spend a lot of money for that. Now, you mentioned the fact that if you're going to be traumatized, you want to be traumatized by by a great work of art. That to me is really striking. Do you feel like in later subsequent conversations with your mother, do you think that she regretted having had you expose yourself so early to what was a traumatic experience at the theater, or was she more kind of open-minded about that and thought that you should maybe see these things at an early age?
Um, you've never met my mother, Danielle. This is a woman of no regret. She, no, she did not regret it. She was apologetic that she'd forgotten, that's for sure. But and then what she regretted was that I had nightmares for several weeks running, and she had to manage those. So that was the sum total. There was no philosophical thought that this was good for my to toughen me up somehow. But it was memorable for me, and it didn't stop me going to horror movies. There's something quite enticing about allowing yourself to be scared and yet knowing that you're safe.
At that time, do you think your fondness for horror films was kindled, or just your fondness for cinema in general?
It's an overstatement to say I have a fondness for horror films. I do enjoy them. They're not a favorite genre, but I don't run away from them. My wife, on the other hand, can't be in the same room. I've been writing a chapter on horror films for this book that Noah and I are doing together, which is an introduction to film for people who don't know a lot about the history of film, and particularly who don't necessarily know how films work, to try to help them understand and the mechanisms that films use to create an effect and draw you in and have you understand the experience of the character. And it was one of the things that was important to me to be part of the course I taught called Madness of the Movies at Yale, but also the book I wrote, it's about abnormal psychology and about the various madnesses and mental illnesses that people can experience, but it's also about how films work to portray that, and when they get things right, when they get things wrong, but either way, what do they do to get us to feel the experience of somebody who is not us? So I lost the question. What was the question? Remind me, and then because I don't want to get off track, and I got off track.
No, that's all right. I enjoy these digressions and these deviations. We were just talking about your fondness for
horror film. That's
horror. If that early striking experience by which you were totally perturbed and at least temporarily traumatized.
Yes.
If that really drew you into the horror genre and made you think, wow, this so fundamentally shook me that I really want to kind of sink my teeth into it and explore it more. Or was it just this experience, more broadly speaking, of being immersed in this emotional, aesthetic experience that led you to a very deep and abiding appreciation for the cinema in general at that young age?
I was always very eclectic. Though there were a lot of horror films on Saturday mornings, there were also musicals and there were also comedies, and I loved them all. It's just that neither the musicals nor the comedies gave me nightmares. So somehow or other, but actually the musicals would give me a joy that I find and they continue to give me. I mean, if I ever want and need to be in a happy place because I'm feeling a little down in the dumps, I'll just watch Singing in the Rain, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And we have taught our granddaughters the wonders of Singing in the Rain, so they can sing at least half of the songs and know all the lyrics and mimic half of the dances. And they get a lot of joy out of it too. So one of my pleasures as a grandfather is sharing the things I love, and one of the things I love is movies.
But what is impossible to mimic is that Gene Kelly smile. That's
that's true, and most of his footsteps are impossible to mimic.
He's an extraordinary. I remember I watched that film just a couple of years ago, and
excuse me, Daniel, was that your first time seeing it?
It was. Of course, I'd heard the music before, but I'd never watched the entirety of the film. I probably had seen pieces of it, the more iconic scenes. But I watched that and was just completely overwhelmed by Gene Kelly's talent. I mean, and then of course, I researched his background and how, he was a dancer in New Jersey, and I think his brother was a dancing instructor as well, and he sort of emerged out of that world. And I was just so taken by his stage presence, right? It's so inimitable, the smile, the the happiness that he exudes, especially in that film, and the way in which he carries his body, the physicality, but also the depth of his acting skills. And I hope that more people in my generation are able to go back and rediscover these films and appreciate their greatness. And that's something that I want to address with you as well.
Yeah. By the way, just about this film, one of the
Mhm.
reasons that film works so well is that he has in Donald O'Connor a partner who can dance every bit as well as he can.
Yep.
The two of them together are just a marvel.
Yeah.
And it's got great songs, and it's funny, and it's smart because it's making fun of, but somewhat realistically portraying the transformation of movies from silence to sound. So there's a little bit of movie history in there. And it just has such a feel-good feeling to it.
Yeah.
The Good Morning number just is the one that puts a smile on my face each and every.
Yeah. And it's so wholesome, and it captures that transition, a seminal transition from the silent pictures to the spoken word. It captures it so expressively. Now, in contrast, there was a film that was released, I think, just last year called Babylon, which you may or may not have seen. And
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I would probably recommend against your watching it. But Damien Chazelle, I think, is the director of that film, who has quite an oeuvre. I mean, he has some excellent films under his belt, including Whiplash. But this film, in my opinion, was just an utter failure. But he tried, at least at the end, to capture the singing in the rain essence. In fact, he actually includes that, images from that film in his own film.
That's interesting.
Sort of kind of like a meta message that he's trying to send. But again, he didn't quite succeed in it.
Did you like La La Land?
I actually did. I mean, I didn't love it. I don't think that it quite competes with a film like Singing in the Rain. But I thought it was.
I'm a bit of a curmudgeon about that film.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, my understanding was he was trying to do a brilliant 1950s musical, but put a dark story in there, which I could have some respect for. But then he chooses actors who can't dance,
and that's the gripe.
And they also can't sing.
And I was just about to say that, for all the reverence I have for the great and handsome Ryan Gosling, about whom not enough can be said. He is not quite suited for that. It just isn't.
You're being generous. The man has two left feet.
Well, in case he ever wants to accept an invitation to this show, I need to hold that door open.
Fair enough.
But no, I joke. And I think that's the universal, criticism of a film like that. But I like the fact that Chazelle is willing to go there to try to create a different novel concept, and that's you'll soon learn from me is one of my constant disappointments with modern cinema. It's just it's so redundant, it's so half-baked and warmed over. I mean, anytime a director is willing and a studio is willing to put forth something that's stimulating and novel, I at least will give it what's the golfing term? Maybe like a handicap. I'll handicap it. Like Babylon, it was daring. It failed, I think, but it was something new. And
well, let me show that I can be generous to him as well, which is that I think the opening of La La Land is brilliant. The opening sequence when you have the traffic jam and everyone's dancing, that is really good, and that's in many ways it's inventing a new way of doing a dance number. But then when he has the two leads, what is it, Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling?
Emma, yes.
And she has this wonderful audition moment where it's beautifully acted, but again, she can't sing. But she's not asked really to sing. It's kind of a talk song. But when the two of them are trying to do, frankly, probably not Gene Kelly, but Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers on this bluff overlooking Los Angeles, it's supposed to be so incredibly romantic, and neither of them can get their feet off the ground. I mean, it was very sad. So I I have very mixed feelings about the movie, and especially because I do love the idea of trying to recapture the wonderfulness of expressing an emotion physically in dance or in song. And the best musicals do that. And it's very hard to find a good musical in the last 20 years that captures that. I say last 20 years, maybe the last 40 years. Maybe start this. I mean, there are a handful of movies that I admire from the 60s on in the musical genre, but most of them are badly cast and have songs that for me are not memorable. So
Yeah,
so I'm a Fred Astaire fan. I admire Gene Kelly, but Fred Astaire is my god.
yeah. And to what do you attribute that sort of lapse in um, in talent? Do you think that it simply is a matter of talent? Do you think that the actors and the performers of yesteryear were just better trained, better performers, had better stage presence?
They were better trained. Very few of them were in movies before they had done something else. Almost all of them had been in some kind of theater. Um, Even ones who are not famous for being in musicals had a musical background. They had James Cagney was a tap dancer, and you can see that when he is being a gangster, and the way he walks has almost a balletic quality to it. And then of course he did one of the best musicals ever, Yankee Doodle Dandy, where he plays George M. Cohan and he dances up a storm. But he might have had an entire career where he never danced, and yet you know that this is a person who has a physicality that may or may not come naturally, but is very well trained. The studio system did something useful, which was during the 30 or 40 years that it existed before it dissolved in the 50s. They gave an enormous amount of opportunities for training all their actors. So almost every actor, whether or not they came there knowing how to dance and know how to move, we're taught how to move, and we're taught how to dance, and we're taught how to sing as best they can. And also a lot of people who had the natural talent and came from theatrical backgrounds then wound up in the movies. We don't have the training ground now, and we don't have the opportunities for people to be mediocre but to learn how to be better before they wind up in an A-level movie because they're good looking.
Yeah, and do you think it's simply a matter of traction and name recognition triumphing over the mere, basic talent? It seems to be the case. I mean, you take Ryan Gosling is probably the best example in casting him in La La Land, because what woman, middle-aged woman, isn't going to go to that film? You combine, the dreamscape of LA and music and dancing and Ryan Gosling's face brandished on the poster. Of course, that's going to be a draw. I'm also thinking of Pierce Brosnan, who was cast in the film production of Mamma
Perfectly.
Mia.
The guy cannot sing a note.
Yeah, and again, a big fan of his. I think he's played a great James Bond.
Absolutely.
But
James Bond doesn't have to sing.
Right, quite the contrary. I mean, he would never, very monotonous and stoic. Not exactly the exuberant presence that you would expect in a Mamma Mia rendition. So,
right.
Again, I think that they're prioritizing, these handsome faces and illustrious names instead of the talent, I think, and the ability that really would sell. And today, I think that problem is exacerbated a little bit more, because now we're bringing in, a topic that's sensitive, but you're bringing in the diversity component where you need, very specific gender identities and racial groups and sexual persuasions and all sorts of strange, novel categories that I think in the past weren't as seriously considered. And now bringing them in, you hope that it doesn't risk even further the talent that has been kind of slipping, but maybe it does. So do you think that there could be a renaissance of these great musicals that become feature films, or do you think that as an art form is best kept in the past and viewed?
I don't know. I mean, what happened sometime in the mid-'60s is musicals as a genre lost the populace. People were, first of all, I think the main reason for that was that rock music became so central to the culture, and musicals didn't know how to use that. And the musicals that they put out had very traditional songs that were inspired more by things from the 1930s and 40s rather than the music of the day. And when they started doing rock musicals, they also, it was very hard for them to figure out how to put them within the structures of the standard musical, and it's still an issue. The other part that we haven't addressed that I would want to say is important is that it's not just that they have people who don't know how to do the basics that are necessary for a musical, singing and dancing. Because several of the movies do have very good and talented and unknown performers who become known because they're really good. The new Steven Spielberg West Side Story is filled with a handful of dancers and actors who do not have a name and who made a major impression in the film because they're good at what they're expected to do. They can dance and they can sing. But the other thing that has been lost is how dance is photographed. And famously, Fred Astaire insisted that every single dance number was shown with the dancer's body being shown in whole. You never cut to his feet, you never cut to his hands. You saw Fred Astaire dancing, and you saw Ginger Rogers dancing, and there were cuts, but the cuts would be a change of angle showing their full bodies at all times. Dance needs to be allowed to express itself by the whole body, and as soon as you start focusing in, what happened was a lot of the quick editing that has become the kind of norm of more modern movies. Some of it's really good for suspense and action films, but it totally destroys the sense of place and the sense of grace when you're watching a dance. No matter what kind of dance, whether it's hip hop, whether it's tap dancing, whether it's more formal ballroom or ballet dancing, if you don't see the entire body, you're not getting the whole experience. And I think that's a major loss. A movie that people admired was the film of Chicago, and I thought it was desperately bad. Why? Because they were constantly showing us feet, arms, everything but the whole body, and they had some really good dancers there. And so they undid, they took something away from what they normally might have been able to bring to the screen by not trusting to allow us to see the entire performer. And that was, to me, a dismaying movie, dismaying because Chicago's a really good musical. And the other thing they did was with great arrogance, replace the choreography of Bob Fosse with Rob Marshall's choreography, and he's no Bob Fosse. So by the way, they used to do something bad like that in musicals of the days when musicals were popular in the 40s and 50s. They take a really good musical that had 12 brilliant songs for Broadway, and they would bring it into the movies, and they would drop half of the songs and replace them with mediocre ones. That happened way too often. They always somehow thought that they had to fiddle with it to create new value, and they often removed what was so special about the original production. So there's no period you can say did everything right. But the Fred Astaire musicals are pretty close to that, and most of the Arthur Freed musicals, which are the ones that Gene Kelly did for MGM, are close to perfect. In part because really great songs, really good dances shown in whole. Gene Kelly was every bit as insistent about that. You always saw Gene Kelly from head to toe.
To our great benefit, all of us.
Yeah. Yes, right.
That's a theme on which Noah and I, in our conversation a few weeks ago, briefly touched, and that is the rapidity, the near vertiginous rapidity with which scenes are cut. Now, he was foreshadowing the book on which the two of you are collaborating, about which I want to talk a little bit later.
Oh, okay.
I think it's fascinating, but without revealing too much. But yeah, that's something as a viewer of film, both modern and classic, that's one of the most glaring differentiations is the rapidity, I think, at which the scenes are cut, especially action scenes. and also the dance numbers, to which you
Mhm.
just alluded. Uh, Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. Do you think that our general our generally deficient attention spans are driving that editorial choice, or do you think perhaps it's the opposite? Do you think that because we're now so accustomed to these short, chopped clips that populate, our TikTok videos and Instagram reels and YouTube shorts that are really, really quickly spliced, maybe like a second long? Do you think that's driving our deficiency in attention?
Um, I think it may be two different things. It's clear that attention spans are seriously compromised. Um, in part, people get used to not having to pay attention to anything for more than a few seconds. And so they wind up getting impatient, and maybe even lose some of the skill to be able to sit quietly and absorb something and allow it to reveal itself rather than to have it pushed into their faces. Uh, but I think many of the things in terms of the new editing techniques in the last 30 or 40 years, where the editing is for an action sequence particularly, is quicker, is quite wonderful, because it really it increases the intensity, and it really gets you absorbed in the action. But it's often done badly. As a parallel to my comments about making sure that when you film the dance, you film the whole person. One of the things that is very important in an action sequence is to be able to make sure that everyone in the audience knows where all the characters are at all times, no matter how violent and extreme the fight might be. And some directors are really good at that. Paul Greengrass, for instance, who did a couple of the Bourne movies. The Bourne movies are just up there with probably the best action movies going. They out Bond, James Bond, without a doubt. But what's really good about it is that you always know where you are in space. So there can be a lot of quick cutting for the various motions that are showing that someone is being particularly aggressive or doing a particularly violent move, but you're always knowing who's in the room and where they are in space, and that allows you to really experience the action sequence. As soon as it gets so hectic that you have no idea who's on top, who's on bottom, and who's winning, and you're not going to know that because you never pull back enough to see everyone in the place they are as a whole body before you go down and pay attention to somebody's hand, which is now a fist, and somebody else who has a weapon. As long as you don't allow the moment of awareness of where something is happening, I think you lose a lot of the continuity of the story and a lot of the impact of the sequence. Many directors just don't know how to do that. They're really good at hectic, but they're not really good at showing. And the better directors do both, and especially in action films. And so I don't know that has to do with attention span. It really is making sure that you really understand what you're seeing, and you're given all the information you need to really appreciate it and enjoy it. And again, what's wonderful is when you've got people who know how to do it right. And we've got a lot of folks out there who know how to do it right, and a lot of folks who are highly regarded who don't.
Yeah. So, and you count among those who know how to do it correctly, and perhaps best of all, as the director of the Bourne franchise, or at least the early Bourne films.
Yeah, I think they've had two directors. Greengrass did two of them.
Greengrass. So, can you give us a few other examples, either recent or from the relatively recent past, of really well executed action films? Some that might rank, among your top, let's say, 5. Excluding the Bourne, which might take the first place.
I think you may be stumping me. Nothing comes to mind immediately. What have I seen recently that's an action film? The John Wick movies are well done. Yes. And I haven't seen many of them. I just, in fact, for the very first time, saw John Wick, the first one, and I thought that was extremely well done. I don't remember who directed that. but I think it was quite good in the exact kinds of things I'm talking about. There's a lot of violence in that movie. In fact, it's almost nothing but. But you always know, first of all, there's a motivation. The bad guy's killed his dog. So we've got a reason that he's going crazy about this. But then, and the other one that was a very good movie recently is a movie called Nobody, which I'm blocking his name. The fellow who's the star of Better Call Saul. Can you remember?
Yeah, I don't.
Bob
Yeah.
Odenkirk.
Yeah.
This was the first thing I think he did after Better Call Saul ended. Now, that was a really good show, by the way, and Breaking Bad is brilliant. And in fact, that entire series I would point to as they knew how to do action, they knew how to do drama, they knew how to do satire, they knew how to do comedy. They just had it all together. And they were relentless at keeping your blood pressure and up and your heart pounding. So I love the fact that
and your cortisol level's high. And
I actually did what I think was probably the best way of watching that, which is I actually didn't watch Breaking Bad for the first 2 years. It took me a while to realize that it was out there. And when I started watching it, I binge watched it with our next door neighbor, and his wife would come, and we would binge watch it together, 2 episodes at least every night, sometimes 3 nights a week. And we would watch one episode, then another, and then we kind of look at each other and say, one more? It was kind of like peanuts. And what was brilliant,
just so you know, I approached it in the same way. I binged it in my own way. A couple of years after the first season was released.
Right. I think that's the way to do it, because one of the things that happens definitely in the first few seasons, I think they slowed down a little bit later, but each episode was like a heartbeat after the previous episode. There was the action continued. It was not like 2 weeks later, this kind of thing. It was one split second later.
Oh yeah, you'd have the death of Jesse's drug-addled girlfriend, right? Whom from whom Walt withheld any services.
Right. Yes.
And then the very next episode, he's like, "You're right back in that room the morning of."
Right.
Where do you go from here? So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It was
anyway, that's a film that was just done by professionals and done really well, and they knew what they were doing. They knew how to do it. But Nobody's really that's a good one too, and that is also relentlessly violent. But the violence is you always know who's doing what to whom and why. And that really helps. And that grabs you. That makes you invested in the movie. It makes you want to be rooting for somebody and trying to understand why people are doing the things that they're doing. That film grabbed me. That was a good one. And the John Wick did too, but I think Nobody was better.
Yeah. It's funny. Nobody's a film of which I think I saw a small portion, but was taken by the action sequences and the violence. I think that it was surprising to see what is the actor's name? The Better
Bob Odenkirk.
Odenkirk. It's always not unsettling, but surprising to see actors inhabiting different roles from what you would expect. And for him to inhabit this role was really startling for me. But I really enjoyed it. And as for John Wick, you're right. I think I first watched it kind of mindlessly on a plane ride and was just completely sucked into it. And it's funny because there is a bit of a cult around Keanu Reeves. He's this enigmatic figure in an industry that I think I don't know. It's kind of an industry of conformity. It's strange to say that because you would think that there are a bunch of eccentric artistic types, but at least maybe ideologically, a lot of them are kind of walk in lockstep. And Keanu Reeves always just seems like this outcast among others. So I think
he's had an interesting career. He's a good looking guy. He moves well. He's a good actor, and he's played everything from drug-addled adolescent to
Bill and Ted to Neo,
and
iconic roles. I mean, The Matrix, of course, is an iconic film, and John Wick has garnered this, like I said, sort of a cult following that, and so much so that there are 4 iterations of the film now. It's become in its own
Now
franchise.
I'm not moved to. I was very happy with John Wick. I'm not sure I need to see another one.
Yeah, let alone 4.
Right, or much less 4. Somebody might have to tell me something that makes me something that's different or interestingly varied in them, because I have a feeling that they're basically the same thing over and over again. But
Yeah.
I may be wrong.
No, you're absolutely correct, but it's the Keanu effect. Let's talk about that just briefly. I mentioned it earlier. It's this redundancy that we see in Hollywood today. Just take the Marvel cinematic universe as the most obvious example. You have how many iterations of Iron Man and the Hulk and Thor. And Disney similarly is now releasing The Little Mermaid, right? And I guess it's interesting in some regard in that they're bringing it to live action, and they're sort of anthropomorphizing these little creatures under the sea. And I don't know how successfully they're doing that, but they look a little uncanny to me. But at least it's a little different. The story's pretty much the same, but again, it feels like there's just a. It
But
feels
the only
like
justification.
it feels as though we're at an ebb of creativity, and maybe that's not completely true, but in some regards, it feels that way. It feels like the studios are just producing for profit, and of course, I mean that's you need to run a business in a certain way. They'll release The Shape of Water, a film, a very kind of niche film, and it'll capture the Oscar for Best Picture. So that's not a film that's going to bring in a lot of money, and I understand that to enable them to produce a film like that, whether or not it is a good film on its merits is a different matter. But to enable them to do that, they have to produce 10 Lion King renditions or Toy Story 5s or what have you. So do you think, like me, that the cinema, Hollywood, is in something of a low ebb creatively, or where, how do you perceive it?
I think it's definitely at a low ebb creatively. I think The Little Mermaid is a good example. There was absolutely no reason on earth to do a so-called live action version, because I understand that, what is it, Halle Berry is the mermaid? I think so, but I think she and the prince are the humans, and everything else is CGI. Everything else is computer generated. So they're calling it a live action movie, but it's basically a computer action movie with a few live people in it. And that the only thing that might possibly justify it is diversity, is the possibility that, okay, the mermaid is now a woman of color. But otherwise, there's no reason to make this movie except to make money. Somebody thought this is a film that everybody loved back then, and so maybe they'll love it again now if we do it with a twist, and that's the twist. But usually, almost universally, the live action version of the better Disney cartoons are second rate. I don't know of one that's really well done. I think maybe Beauty and the Beast was not bad, but not bad is not singing its praises. But I think these franchise films are being made simply for money, and they're just kind of throwing the dice and seeing if, can we come up with a slightly different combination of superheroes. The chapter I just finished in the book that we're not supposed to be talking about, which that I'm doing with Noah, I just finished the chapter we're going to do on horror films, and I had the pleasure of watching a whole lot of horror films that I maybe hadn't seen in 40 years or had never seen. And it's clear to me, but I certainly was the sense I've had over the years, is the horror films have sequels on top of sequels. I mean, Friday the 13th, number 47. And invariably what happens is that the first one, like the Nightmare on Elm Street, is an absolutely brilliantly scary and very creative horror film. What could be more frightening that if you go to sleep, your nightmare is going to come and kill you, and it's going to really come and kill you. It's not just going to scare you awake. That's a brilliant concept, and it's one we can identify with, because we all sometimes sleep badly and sometimes have a bad dream that we are very glad we wake up from. So this was a brilliant inspiration by Wes Craven, and it was really well done with a very good cast. And then they do sequels, and Wes Craven has nothing to do with the early sequels. They have a new director and a new writer, and since they killed off most of the teenagers, they have to have new actors. And so the only consistency is the monster, Freddy Krueger, and maybe the setting, and maybe the final girl, because most of these movies famously have the one surviving teenager who's usually a girl, and is usually one who's sexually pure, as against her promiscuous friends, all of whom get killed for their labors. But so maybe you have the final girl, you have the monster, and you've got the nightmares. But you don't have the inspiration, you don't have the creativity, and frankly, they don't know what to do with it. So they either retread something that's been done already, or they stretch it in a way that defeats the logic structure. Even fantasy films, even films with magic or supernatural, have to have a logical structure that makes sense within the story. And if you violate that, the audience is going to object. They're going to have a hard time with it. There's a violation in the original Nightmare on Elm Street, and I'm fresh about it because I just watched it, which is the very closing sequence, and it turns out that the closing sequence sets up the fact that Freddy Krueger is still alive, and therefore we may make more movies. Why is it there? And it's a violation because Freddy Krueger was clearly and completely dead, wiped out, eliminated. And then all of a sudden he's back, and he's back. Why? Because the producers said, we want to be able to have a sequel. And so it's a 60-second add-on piece where all of a sudden the mother and three of the friends, all of whom have been killed in the movie, are alive again.
Yeah. You sacrifice a lot to enable you to produce that next film.
Right, exactly.
And it's a cheap kind of I don't know, meretricious sacrifice that they all embark upon.
It's cheap and it's cheating, and and if the film is good enough, you kind of don't notice it until you've thought about it afterwards. But either way, you're likely to be disappointed by the sequel, except that if all you're looking for is the thrills of watching people gruesomely be killed. And obviously there's an audience for that. But the movies are likely to be mediocre. Now, every once in a while, there's one that is as good as or is better. If Godfather is famous, that Godfather 2 was probably a better movie, and Godfather 1 was brilliant, and Godfather 2 was brilliant plus. But that doesn't happen very often. And Godfather 2 had a justification, not just that we were going to repeat the formula, but we were going to film the rest of the novel, which included a background of the major characters, including what they were doing and how they got that way from their younger days, which was not in the original movie. So there's value, there's story, there's depth that was added in Godfather 2, and also they kept all the same actors and the same writer and the same director. So these people are committed.
So in response to the insoluble debate over Godfather 1 versus 2, it sounds as though you take the side of the second one.
I take the side of the second one, but I think Godfather 1 is brilliant. I mean, it's a wonderful.
My partiality inclines me toward number 1, just because
Okay.
I love Marlon Brando. I'm a Brando boy.
He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant in that, and that film is brilliant. And Godfather 2 is also brilliant. And I wouldn't fight you loving Godfather 1. If you speak to me tomorrow, I might prefer it.
It's purely the Brando factor. I mean, if substitute anybody else for him, and certainly I wouldn't then elevate 1 over 2. But that would be my
in Godfather 2, we get De Niro becoming Brando. And he's not Brando, but he's pretty darn good.
He's good, but still, I love Brando. Probably one of my favorite actors.
But anyway, to me, that's an example. I mean, example that a sequel can be justified and can be really good, but you have to have a reason to make it. Besides that, we need to make more money.
Right. So there are certain criteria to which you must hold yourself if you are going to make that sequel in a sort of justifiable way, not just for profit. And It sounds like it has to have purpose. I mean, it has to continue the story arc or complete the story in such a way that is fulfilling and satisfying or unsatisfying, but it has to, it has to have sort of a definitive meaning that one can easily discern.
Mhm.
Let me just say, as you were describing the way in which, Friday the 13th is continually made and remade, the image that came to my mind, and perhaps it's a bit morbid, is almost like taking the healthy body of the first film, uh, and bleeding it and putting leeches on it and
Mhm.
continually purging it, and just sort of, every time you do that, it maybe diminishes the vigor of the initial story of what there was, the essence, until, what do you have? This withered corpse that's pallid and, lifeless. And I think that's where a lot of these horror films find themselves. And
Daniel, I think you have just defined a really good new horror film. Somebody's creating an undead monster from the body of what had been a healthy movie.
Yeah. Oh boy, that'll be kind of trippy on a couple different levels. But actually, I should say here, not to get too off course, but as we were talking about rock musicals,
Mhm.
and we'll have to talk about this maybe when we're not recording, but there is an idea that I've had gestating for a while, and I might be embarking on writing my own rock musical. So stay tuned for that, all my listeners. But Dr. Charney, I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we're off the record.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But I have to ask, are you um, are you strong enough to endure these countless hours of immersion in these horror films, or do you feel as though after having spent so much time in them, you are traumatized once again, as you were at the age of 8 when you were going to the 25-cent film?
I actually mentioned something to my wife the other day, by the way, who has been hiding in the other room for all the time I've been looking at horror films because she has no tolerance for them.
And I
Uh,
should say, let me interrupt. Having read her book and
mhm.
greatly enjoyed it, now it's really painting a picture for me. Because for those of you unacquainted with your wife, she was a professor of French literature at Yale University,
Yes.
you also taught, and she's, from what I can tell, a brilliant woman, and very eloquent, and her writing is so mellifluous. And now I'm trying to imagine her in the same room with you as you watch Friday Friday the 13th
Not
version
going to happen.
23, as she's contemplating Marcel Proust, and
She
Jean-Paul
she
Sartre.
could not tolerate Breaking Bad. So
Uh-huh.
it was me and our next door neighbors. My wife was not in the room. On the other hand, she was totally absorbed by the entire 6 years of The Sopranos. So go
So
figure.
I was just about to use that as an example of my having immersed myself in a certain series that is, I think, morally unsettling,
Mhm.
to put it mildly. And I
Mhm.
was watching The Sopranos and enjoying the importance of that series, and really appreciating it for its cultural relevance and the fact that it is esteemed as one of the great series of all time. Uh, but after like season 2 or 3, 4, I just started to feel like, and I'm from New Jersey, I just started to feel like I was becoming morally degraded after,
Mhm.
watching each episode every single night. So, and I didn't have a good way of remedying that. So I had to
Oh,
adjust.
so you were binging The Sopranos, huh?
Yeah, but again, my binge is not the normal binge. Like, I might watch 30 minutes at a time, but I'll watch it maybe every night. So I'm not watching 3 to 5 hours of Sopranos every day
Mm.
consecutively. I might watch a portion of a show maybe 3 days consecutively. So to me, that's a binge. It's sort of like a half serious binge, but
Well,
still, I felt like,
I'm intrigued by that. So you wouldn't even watch a full episode. You
no.
dissect the episode?
I should say, I for a if the show is like 45 minutes to an hour, yes, I'll try to extend it out to a full show. Breaking Bad, I think that was more like a 30-minute episode. I think.
No. Breaking Bad was
Was
1
it?
hour each, give or
Was
take
it an hour?
5 minutes.
Okay, so I might be misrepresenting my approach. Usually, I would try to get through an entire episode, but I wouldn't do multiple episodes on one day. I wouldn't binge in that way.
Was
But
it because it was too overwhelming for you, or because we're not dealing attention span, Daniel? Because you certainly
no,
somebody who seems like he's got a good attention span.
no. I think my attention is mature enough to be able to handle it, and I have the endurance. I think for me, it's when you're trying to work through a series and you have other projects on which you want to be working, like if it's right, sometimes I feel a little guilty. Like if I'm sitting down, every single night, if you're, okay, here's an hour devoted to The Sopranos, when, if I can watch most of it and then kind of start working on a song or an article or an episode or something like that. That's always my issue, and it's not the best approach, because I know you do need to devote the time and have the appropriate attention to really absorb into and appreciate these works. But I did find over the course of a few seasons of Sopranos exposure, I just felt like, man, am I entering a stage of moral decadence and decay? Am I going to end up next to Tony in with the fishes, or any of his compatriots? So how do you guard yourself against that?
It's an interesting thing, because I just saw the final episode of Succession, which is a show on HBO that I have enjoyed. And they just ended the run, which is it's been a 4-year run. And there you're immersing yourself in really bad people doing really bad things, not murderously bad things, but just morally bad things, which is in many ways worse. And also kind of glorying in rich people being unhappy. So does it affect my moral compass? I don't know, but it may numb us to bad behavior by finding it entertaining. I mean, these people are really bad, but they come up with some of the best verbal insults that you can ever imagine. I don't know if you've seen anything of Succession, but it is a very, very smart show, and it's filled with incredibly smart and vulgar put downs. That are or would be quotable if this wasn't a PG-13 podcast.
This podcast has no rating.
I know, I'm teasing.
But
in part because I can't remember them myself, but they are very witty. And in fact, I just saw a compilation of somebody putting together the best of 4 years of the put downs. These are siblings who are rivaling with each other to see who's going to take over the major company. And they have a world-class terrible father who kind of plays them against each other, offering each of them that they're going to get the prize, but not honestly wanting any of them to get the prize. And then they did something very bold, which is they finally killed him off. The head of the company died this season. But of course, the title of the show is Succession. And as the writer said, I had to allow the story to move forward. And the succession couldn't happen until the founder was no longer there. But he was just not the moral centerpiece, but he was the dramatic center of the show. And I thought, they're going to lose something major now that he's gone. But in fact, the story was compelling to the end. And we are watching very bad people behave badly in a universe that feels not like our own, because I can't suddenly decide to get into a plane and fly to Barbados because I want to meet somebody for lunch, but they can. But morally questionable, because all their choices are so narcissistically selfish and also thoughtless. With one thought in mind, I want to win. So Sopranos, I always thought of as a family drama, and to me, what was powerful about it was this guy was doing really bad things, but it was all he had ever known, because he was pretty much brought up to believe that this world, this mafia world that he was part of, this organized crime world, that's what he knew.
Now we
And
should know you don't mean family friendly
no,
drama.
it's not. No,
Family,
no,
it's a
no, no,
family
no.
drama in a
It's
very
not
different way.
family friendly.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's
I
not
know
family friendly. Just
I
like the
I
movie,
agree.
just like,
I
excuse me, Daniel, just like the
Sure.
movie Night at the Hunter, which is based on a children's fairy tale, an imagined one, is not a movie I would ever show children.
Right. I would say it's interesting that you point that out. The fact that The Sopranos is in Succession is in some ways a family drama. That that makes me think, and I've never thought this before, that it's akin to tragedy in a certain way, because fundamentally, tragedy, as originally conceived, is supposed to involve sort of an aristocratic or highly reputed or highly ranking individual. Like think of Oedipus, right?
Mhm.
And he is subject to fate in a similar way that maybe Tony Soprano is subject to fate. He enters into this existence kind of in the world of the mafioso. I mean,
Mhm.
you see this through his father's interactions with his mother, and
Right.
the end to which his father ultimately comes, and the way that his mother kind of carries on in a certain way. But certainly Tony could
She,
change.
she was a brilliantly nasty character.
Yeah, yeah. I was happy to see her put in the old folks' home. um, but yeah, yeah, just a terrible character. But again, this isn't a life that Tony volitionally was able to choose or to steer away from. Perhaps, he does have free will. He could have, but there is something predestined in his realm, in his existence. And if you're really reading deep into it, I think it is tragic in that way, that he's entering into this life to which the fates have sort of led him. So it's really interesting in that way. And when you say family drama, I think we can really explore that theme. And Succession, I think, by the way you describe it, might be similar in that regard. You're talking about wealthy aristocratic individuals, who are dealing with the complexities of the business or whatever, the enterprise over which they are presiding, and the ways in which they are moving it from one generation to the next. But these people are stuck in this as an accident of birth. They were born into this, so that's something with which they have to grapple, but for which they didn't really have a vote. They're just in it. Now,
Right.
I don't mean to be too esoteric and bring in ideas of ancient Greek poetics, but I'm also reminded of Aristotle and his idea of catharsis. In his poetics, he describes this as one of the central purposes of drama,
Mhm.
tragedy specifically, but it's this idea of catharsis. And catharsis is understood a little bit differently in modern language, but back then it meant sort of a purging. It was supposed to be morally uplifting by cleansing you of all the terror and slaughter and moral corruption that you would view on the stage. At the end, there was supposed to be something that kind of restored you back to a more edified place. Do you think a lot of our films and series today lack that essential Aristotelian feature? I know that's kind of
I,
a
I, yeah, I would
learned
say that they
question.
do. In fact, I think the modern way is to leave it quite ambiguous or unclear as to whether or not any of the characters were going to be able to experience a catharsis, much less than anyone in the audience. I mean, think about the famous ending for The Sopranos. But what is powerful in The Sopranos, and why I think of it as a family story, is that from the very first episode, and they had no idea they were going to go 6 years. They planned a year, and then when it became a big hit, and it took a while for that to happen, it wasn't successful instantly. But by the end of the first year, it had a real buzz, and by the end of the second year, it was a cult. Um, uh, in the first episode, he winds up going to see a psychiatrist because he has a panic attack when he sees the ducks fly away from his swimming pool. And so the authors knew what they were doing, because the subject and which came out in the psychotherapy, early on in one of the first episodes, not the very first, but within the first season, was that he saw the ducks as a family, and he was hit in a way that struck him so emotionally that he panicked, and he found himself feeling like he was having a heart attack, and he was breathing hard, and I think he fainted, and what he was experiencing was the loss of family. And throughout the entire series, he talks about doing everything that he's doing, killing people, to protect his family and create a better life for his kids. And he sees it not happen. What he sees is his wife, who knew what he was doing from day one, but winds up kind of turning a blind eye to it. And so she becomes morally corrupted, even though she never does a bad thing, but she accepts staying with him. And the kids are a mess. And neither of them is strong enough to be entering into the mafia world, but they're not really strong enough to do anything at the end of this story. So he ends not just being killed, because it probably reflects the fact that he was killed at the end. It's left unclear, brilliantly left unclear. But in fact, if he was killed at the end, then probably the rest of the family was killed too, because would they be so specific that they would only take an automatic to Tony when he's sitting right next to his wife and his two kids are on the other side of the booth? Mm-hmm. You will never know. But even if nobody else dies, his family is severely compromised and will be forever because of the choices he made. That's tragedy.
Yeah, I agree. And to draw a link, you can look at Walter White and his behavior, right, in regard to his family as well. Again, not as tragically fated, I don't think, as Tony Soprano was, but he made decisions, similarly motivated decisions, to enable his family to prosper, whether it be with him in this world or outside it or beyond it somewhere.
Well, if you remember, again, this is actually something I think the creators either lost track of on purpose or maybe not on purpose. But the original reason that he got into the drug business, Walter White, is that he got a diagnosis of a terminal cancer.
Of course.
So his issue was, I want to leave my family with some money when I'm gone. Somehow he managed to survive for 6 years of Breaking Bad and not look at all sick. So I think they lost track of that on purpose, but and it doesn't end well for him. But so I was reading an article. What was it about? Oh, it was actually talking about Succession and mentioning Breaking Bad, and talking about, there was an iconic moment which I had forgotten, where Walter White is repeatedly saying, "I'm doing this for my family. I'm doing this for my family." And at one point near the end of the series, he says, "I did this for myself." And I had forgotten that, and it is in fact a real moment. And
that might mark the full transformation from Walter White to the Heisenberg
right.
Ego,
yeah,
or id. I'm not sure.
Or id, right. No, he loved being Heisenberg.
Yeah.
But anyway, again, there's a tragedy there. He was going to die anyway. He wanted his family to have some way of living well after he was gone. And then he found himself stimulated and excited by what he discovered he could do so well, which was to concoct meth.
Yeah. Which I learned was actually some sort of like a rock candy. I learned later that they concocted a sugary blue.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you mean
raspberry, blueberry
what they were
rock
looking like?
candy.
Yeah.
And I read in an interview that between takes, I think, then they were deep in the basement. Actually, I think this was an interview on YouTube on that. Now that I think of it, that Hot Ones show where they have the guest eat a hot wing and
Oh yes, I like that show.
Yeah, it's a brilliant and creative show. But yeah, Walter White confesses that I think during one of the scenes they were filming down in the lair in the meth lab, overseen by Gus and the cartel. Aaron Paul was sneaking nibbles of
Nibbles of the pretend
the
meth. Yeah.
product, and it was rock candy. And of course, Bryan Cranston is famous for being very serious on set and kind of sticking to character. And of course, that's a great attribute because it shines through in all of his work. Again, I rank him as one of the best actors out there today. But he kind of meekly succumbed to
he ate some too.
To Paul's encouragement, and he nibbled on the rock can, and then they started eating.
That's funny.
Copious amounts, yeah. So just so many stories from that show, and again another duo that worked brilliantly together. You mentioned the Singing in the Rain with Connell and Kelly earlier. We look at Aaron Paul and
Bryan Cranston.
Yeah. Who are some of your other favorite duos? Your favorite teams of actors or actresses that join together and absolutely.
Well, these go back away. First of all, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, the best. Fred Astaire had many, many good partners, but never anyone as good as Ginger. And Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, and also Cary Grant and Irene Dunne, and also Cary Grant with Audrey Hepburn. They did several movies together. Who else? Oh, Myrna Loy and William Powell in the Thin Man series. Absolutely brilliant couple. And now that's a series, interestingly, I think they did 5 of them, but I would say at least 2 or 3 of them were worth doing. These were sequels where they added value, and then they started repeating themselves. But they're comic detective stories. Have you seen any of the Thin Man movies?
I have not, no, and I plan to.
What's wonderful is they're a married couple, and they act like a married couple who are really crazy about each other, but also can barely tolerate each other's bad habits. And he's I guess he was a former detective who was retired, but he winds up kind of getting enticed back into detective work. But he's got an assortment. He knows all of the downbeat minor gangsters in town, all of whom, a few of them he's put in jail, but they still greet him with great enthusiasm because they like his company. And he drinks too much. Back then, it was not. Nobody was the least bit self-conscious about these people kind of being mildly drunk for most of the movie. But the dialogue between the husband and wife is just precious, and it's very funny. She's always rolling her eyes at his as the people he brings home. And it's just really well done. And it was based on a Dashiell Hammett novel called The Thin Man.
And what is the acting duo there in that series?
Myrna Loy and William Powell.
Yeah. And of course, these are all names with which I need to acquaint myself much more.
Daniel, one of the things that was an inspiration for this Madness at the Movies book that I wrote, and the course that I taught, was discovering that the Yale students that I had an opportunity to teach had almost no experience about movies that were much before when they were born. Mostly I had seniors taking my class. It was meant to be a senior seminar, which means that these students are about to leave. They're about to embark on the next chapter of their lives. And here they are, seniors at Yale, and they have never seen a movie that was in black and white. They've never seen a movie that came out before like 1970. Maybe they saw on YouTube, they saw the shower scene from Psycho, but they've never seen the movie. And so one of my agendas was, hey, you guys, there's a whole world of films out there that you're going to want to know about because they're brilliant. And by the way, a lot of the films you're seeing today are stealing from these old movies. So you might as well see where the original ideas and the original ways of doing it came from. So I made a point of showing older movies, and universally, and I mentioned this in the book, I was thanked by the students saying, my God, you've opened a new world for me. I want to see more movies by Ingmar Bergman. I want to see more movies by Fellini. I want to see more Hitchcock films. And who the heck is William Powell? Boy, I'm going to be excited about that. That wasn't one of them because there's no madness in those movies. But yes, a lot of these movies from the 30s are really well done, and the partnerships are great. Who else is who? Do you have any favorite partnerships that you can think of?
Oh
I'm going
boy.
to toss it back
Um,
at.
um, I would say, again, my breadth of knowledge is much more limited than yours, and my viewership of all these great combinations. But I would agree with the Gene Kelly O'Connell combination. But again, I don't know if that
But,
was
but
seen.
they didn't not do a lot of movies together.
Yeah, but they didn't do multiple things together. So I would have to maybe reserve my answer to that question because I'm not exactly sure. I have to think about. I'm thinking about combinations that were more discreet. They acted in one film together, and it was a.
I'm sorry. I
No, no, no,
misunderstood.
no, no, no. My question. No,
Talking about
no.
people who
You
did
answered.
many.
No, I can't answer my own question. You answered it but perfectly, and I'm so glad that you did because I want to go back and look at these because I know that anytime Hepburn is in a film, it's magical, and I'd like to see her with Grant now, and be able to see that the course of development and evolution of their relationship through multiple films. Like these days, I don't know if that happens as often. I don't know if you'll even in romantic comedies, and maybe that's the place where it does occasionally happen if there
Mhm.
are multiple romantic comedies where you're combining, like, I don't know, Matthew McConaughey and uh, whoever it might be, Sarah Jessica Parker. I don't know. I'm just pulling out a name. But sometimes you'll get a romantic comedy where you have the duo that really clicks and they work well together for multiple films. But it seems like in the earlier films to which you just referred, there's they happened more on a more sustained pattern. Am I
Mhm.
wrong to think that?
No, you're not. Part of the studio system was when this was their version of I guess the franchise films, except they were not. The stories would be totally different.
Mhm.
What the studio system realized is there's magic in this pairing. When Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy are doing a comedy, the fact that they were lovers in real life, somehow or other, there was a magic there. There was a chemistry that came out in the movies. The first one that they did was called Adam and Eve, Adam's Rib, and it's they are both attorneys and they wind up on being on the opposite side of one case, a murder case where this woman killed her husband. And the woman is played by Judy Holliday, and one of the very few movies she did. She was a wonderful comedian. Anyway, that movie became a big hit. So they said, let's have them do another one. So they always played a couple who were not, well, in Adam's Rib they were married to start out with, but in subsequent times they were not married, but they would be teasing each other, and then it would become romantic. Um, and they're just absolutely wonderful. But each story is totally separate. It's just they brought these two people together because they had some chemistry, and they realized the audience loved seeing them together. Now that's different from the Thin Man movies, where it was an ongoing series with an ongoing plot, and they were playing the same characters. The Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, they're playing different characters in each and every movie, but it's always the two of them.
Right,
And yeah, and similarly, Cary Grant never played the same character with Katharine Hepburn or with Irene Dunne, who was another one that he did several movies with. But there was certain chemistry there. They clicked. They were a good comedy team. So let's do another story that with these two people who we know the audience kind of enjoys watching interact.
yeah. Perhaps I'm overlooking some modern examples of that, but it seems less and less to be the trend. Again, it would have to be in the genre of romantic comedies, but I can't think of many really electric duos that persist in
I'm
subsequent
trying
films.
to. I'm
Can you think
blocking
of
on her. Yeah, not a lot of them, but like Tom Hanks did Sleepless in Seattle, and then
uh-huh,
he did You've Got Mail, and I'm
uh-huh.
blocking on the name of who
Was it
his
Meg Ryan?
I think it was Meg Ryan, right? And
Yeah.
so there's two movies where they were together and they worked as a team, as a couple, and they're good movies. You've Got Mail is nowhere near as good as Sleepless in Seattle, but it's still entertaining. But I don't think they did another. So it's just those two. Um,
Yeah, and of course we're talking about male female. I just recently watched Air, and that of course features Ben Affleck and Matt Damon.
and
Of
Matt
course,
Damon.
yeah,
And
and
okay,
they
they're a
always
team.
yeah, yeah, but
With
a
Goodwill
team
Hunting.
in a different way, yeah, and
Yes.
they've certainly produced some good works together jointly,
Mhm.
and that probably because of their long enduring friendship and the way in which they've kind of both come up through the ages. Yeah, I'll have to look into that more, and that's an interesting theme. It's a because so much of it is the way in which the film is sold to
Mhm.
the viewing public, and
Sure.
I think years ago it was again, and another fascinating point is, these were all characters, people about whom we knew very little. They didn't have personal Instagram pages. They didn't have their own personal YouTube channels that would enable you almost voyeuristically to view and watch them in their every waking moment as they
Right.
post videos of their of their consumption of some fancy breakfast at
Breakfast food,
a
right.
Hollywood at a Hollywood restaurant.
Right.
In
Well,
the,
that's a very good point. For instance, I don't think the audience at large knew that Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were involved with each other. Tracy was still married, so this was not something that Hollywood would want to talk about. But everyone in the film industry knew
and
it.
it's right, and it's probably not something on which they reported. I mean, I'm sure that the journalistic class, I'm sure, was apprised of this very scandalous piece of information, but withheld it from public view. There was a certain decorum that was observed then. Now it's if the person himself or herself doesn't announce it to the world on their own platform, you have TMZ awaiting you at the
Right.
airport to
Yes,
snap your
yes.
little smooch, your illicit kiss, and of course, run that headline everywhere. But yeah, there was a different, going back to the example of the Hepburn and the Brando, like these were all figures again of whom you knew very, very little, and for that reason, they were these giants for the studios. You would present Hepburn and again and again and again, and there was this sterling image of this sophisticated, multi-talented actress who could handle any role and was elegant and beautiful and had the the perfect complexion, the facial features, everything. But you didn't know about the peccadillos, and you didn't know about the the extramarital affairs and things like
Right.
that.
Right.
So I think it probably helped the studios in that way, and they were able to cultivate this image, this endearing image that moviegoers absolutely loved. Whereas nowadays, I think because we're so hyper exposed to these people, and we realize that they are not demigods, they are just people, and because there's so much content being produced by average Joes like yours truly, producing content online, or comedians producing content on Instagram, that it's really changed dramatically. I think it's kind of democratized it, and also, if I can use the word, vulgarized it a little bit. It's because it's now really.
I think that's the right word. In democratizing it, you're getting a lot of people who simply are not talented at it, or don't have the discipline, or the opportunity to learn how to have
now. Right now, combine that in a generation overwhelmingly ignorant of great works of the past. Let's say students that did not enroll in your class and didn't take your class. So then that becomes a little bit of a problem, where we're losing the objective acknowledgement of really great works. And I think that's a bit of a problem. You combine the short attention spans, the fact that, everyone's on YouTube, everyone's posting their own content and thinking it's, really swell. And having no, being unrooted in the deep soil that is our culture of cinema and film.
We're in a funny place in the world, because now it is possible for anyone to watch almost any film that has ever been made.
That's the paradox.
With almost no time lag whatsoever. It is true that, for instance, something like Netflix is not rich in older films, but there are streaming services that feature older films, and so they're out there. And But you need to know to look for them. You need to be interested to pursue them. Otherwise, you're just going to see the next film that is being promoted, on YouTube or on Instagram or on Facebook.
Right.
Um,
And who is promoted, and by whom is that promoted? I mean, there's an algorithm. There are,
well,
of course, companies paying for advertisements to place that new ad for the Oppenheimer film in your feed.
right.
But again, is that going to enrich you culturally? Is that going to give you the best aesthetic experience to immerse yourself in a great work of art? Well, maybe in the case of Oppenheimer.
I was about to say that's a movie I have that's a movie
I'm
I
so
have high
excited.
hopes for.
I'm
But
so excited for that one.
but you really, we have so much choice that it's overwhelming. Even
Yeah.
even if we're talking about the relatively current movies. And you know what? Oppenheimer is showing up on your feeds now. 3 weeks after it's out, there's going to be another movie that's showing up on your feeds. And even if Oppenheimer is really a hit, it's not going to be tossed at you in the same way because it's all controlled by people who are paying money to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result, who's paying money to tell anybody to see The Thin Man? Nobody.
Yeah.
And who would even know to look for it if you haven't heard about it? I was going to mention to you that my favorite Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant movie is a movie called Bringing Up Baby. And it is probably
I've heard of it. I've not seen it.
That's probably one of the best of the slapstick movies of the 1930s, and it is very, very funny and very, very smart. And they are really a terrific team comically, and very quick. I mean, it's a Howard Hawks film, and it just goes. But if you haven't heard of Bringing Up Baby, you're never going to see it. And if you've heard of it and you don't not moved somehow to go seek it out, you're not going to watch it either. And I think that's a shame. So, I think anybody who has a college education should be required to take a course in the history of film. But nowadays, nobody's required to take a course in anything.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's a prerequisite to truly consider oneself a cultured individual. And maybe that's a passé term, to be cultured.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. I think it's quite an aspiration and something for which we should all work. But I agree with you entirely, and I think maybe some scholars would perhaps think less of film as a medium worthy of study and pursuit. But I would disagree. I think it's just as ennobling and enriching as many of the great works of literature with which your wife is probably spending her time right now. And it's interesting. This is actually a theme about which Noah and I talked at some length, and that is this unsettling paradox, as I like to think of it, of absolute accessibility of every fine work of art. Every sculpture, painting by Michelangelo is at the click of a mouse accessible to you.
Right.
Now, you might not be able to go there and look at the Pietà, but you can certainly examine it from 360 degrees on the Google service that allows you to zoom in to Mary's face and look into nooks and crannies that you probably wouldn't even be able to see if you were there in Italy. The same in some regard applies to film. I mean, just last night in preparation for our conversation, and after having read your book, and because I was inspired to do so, I was watching a lot of the horror films that you recommend, Repulsion, and some of the other ones.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I wanted to again kind of cleanse my palate. And
did you actually watch Repulsion? Did you see it?
I did. Yeah, it was excellent.
It's brilliant.
But last night I watched The Searchers, just as a different, something different, because I've been spending a lot of time with the horror films. And again, you mentioned the fact that these are immediately available online. This film, I actually picked it up at my local library for no cost. I just rented it for a week. So there's never been a time, during which these great relics of our culture that still, they make our culture that what it is today. They are, accessible in so many different formats, and yet we seem the least willing or stimulated to pursue them. And that's the paradox I see. And I don't know really how how to reconcile it. I hope that in time, having taken courses like yours and having heard conversations like this, people are inspired in some way to go out and just stop by your local library on the way home from work and go to the DVD section. If your laptop still has that ability to receive a DVD
Right.
disc. And sometimes they even have it on like a streaming, your library might have a streaming service or something like that if it's a little bit more sophisticated. But, you pick that up, you get a week's rental, and you can watch every single great film on AFI's list of the top 100.
Right.
And you can do that and absolutely change your appreciation for film. And I think that if we are going to do that, I mean, it would so ennoble us. It would be so great for everyone. So maybe you can just kind of give me a comment or two about that paradox, the wide availability and our
would address
lack.
that. I would address that in a particular way. Are you aware of the Criterion channel? And are you aware of the movie MUBI streaming service?
No, it is MUBI.
Yes, MUBI, MUBI. I don't know where the name comes from. But the Criterion channel is a streaming service, and MUBI is, and both of them feature classic films throughout the history, but a curated selection of classic films, often put together as themes, maybe a collection based by one director, or a collection of films that are featuring women, or a collection of films from a particular country or genre, brilliantly available, with commentary tracks, with background information. The Criterion Collection, which is a DVD collection, that was their original business, and they were famous for making available the best version of a film, usually often a cleaned up version of an older film that had all the scratches removed and the sound improved. Then coupling it on the DVD with interviews by the people who made the film, or by critics of the film, by other films that are connected with it, by group discussions about it, all on DVD. It was like a class about each film. And every DVD had these extras, and when I'm not talking trivial extras like an interview with the actress to talk about what it was like being dragged around because there were special effects or something, but serious discussion about how the film was made and explaining the import of certain scenes, the history behind it, available for each and every movie that they produced. And I think they have probably a catalog of 1,000 films now. But in the day that now that DVDs are less popular, they have this second business, which is a streaming service, which takes many of these same films and includes many, but not all of the same extra material. And this is a place, and Mubi has some of the same, but Criterion Channel is a more complete collection, where you can go and you can catch The Thin Man. You can catch Bringing Up Baby. You can also catch an Asian film you've never heard of that's brilliant. You can. It's not just old films and then films that are in black and white. It's films that came out 3 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, that somebody thinks are worth preserving and are special. And I think it's just an incredible resource, because Netflix and Amazon Prime does not give you that. It costs like $8 a month, for Pete's sake. And for $8 a month, you've got a curated collection of the best movies in the history of film.
Thank you so very much for explaining that. And
by the way, have no connection with this. I am not selling this in any way. I just love it.
I imagine you in a back room doing the curation and doing the record. It's almost on the level of a biblical exegesis, the way you describe it. And it's perhaps this is profane of me, but the Bible is so interconnected. It's the great hyperlinked text.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it on its own, within its own boundaries and pages, is it the height of maybe poetic and spiritual achievement and literary achievement, but it also is the inspiration for so many other great works in the arts. And it sounds as though, in some respect, this type of streaming services is able to kind of capture that in a very small and, like I said, less godly way. But
Right, right.
you're taking these films and, really, okay, it's almost like a textual analysis. We're
You're
looking,
taking them seriously. You're taking them
yes,
ser-
as I think,
you're meant to enjoy them, but you're taking it seriously in terms of the intention and the effect.
right. You're meant to enjoy them, but you're also meant to be edified by them. And I think that
Yes.
second part is what is lacking in common modern film.
Hmm.
Um, so I like that idea of a very deep analysis, and I'll include links to those two streaming
I
services.
would
And
also, the Criterion Channel is the streaming service. The Criterion Collection is the DVD
uh,
collection. And this probably may be time sensitive in that it may not apply a week or so from now. But right now, the Criterion Collection is giving a 30% discount on all their DVDs.
huh,
If there was ever a favorite movie that you wanted to own a copy of, this is the place to go. Um,
yeah,
but otherwise, the streaming service maintains a rotating collection of films that is really quite impressive.
yeah. So your book, The Madness at the Movies, is based on the course that you taught for many years,
Yes.
of which it's a more popular extension. And you talked about the response by some of those seniors to whom you taught, and how gratifying it was to see them emerge from what they probably considered a course about film, really enriched by this cultural
Mhm.
experience. Can you talk about that a little bit more? How gratifying was that really, and do you think that the students were then able to carry on in their lives, pursuing these great films? Do you think that it was a good door through which a lot of people then walked in and found much more than what you had provided?
I certainly hope so. I mean, there isn't a good way for me to know how many people have kind of sustained their interest, but that they would make the point of talking about it that way at the time that the course might be, winding down. Um, and the fact that they were so enthusiastic about so many of the films that I showed them, and in their discussions, and they were so thoughtful about them, and often saw things that I hadn't seen, and kind of made me rethink some of my ways of approaching some of these movies. So they were so engaged that it would be hard for me to imagine that there wasn't um, some powerfully positive follow-up to this after they were on their own. Um, the main thing was opening the door, well, they said we've never seen a black and white film, and then they're suddenly totally immersed in a black and white film, and they're appreciating what makes it different and beautiful. Because black and white cinematography can be remarkably powerful, but also it didn't matter to them that it was something that they hadn't experienced before. It was because the story was so good, the acting was so good, the way it was presented was so creative, that they were just immersed in it in a way that made it hard for them to not start chatting about it and talking about it and expressing their enthusiasm and then telling their friends. So I discovered from several times that people said, I started watching this movie and I called my roommate in, and 3 people down the hall came in, and we wound up having a little festival watching this film, and we were all blown away by it.
Yeah.
By the way, that was gratifying, because one of the things I did with the course that I was not you can't do with a book, and that was actually one of the reasons I found myself hesitating and taking a while to figure out how to write this book, was that when I did this as a class at Yale, the students would watch the film the day before the seminar each and every week, the featured film. They would watch it together in a darkened room on a large screen with a good sound system, as part of the group experience of being in an audience, which is profoundly different from watching it on your computer screen, whether or not you have other folks with you. If you're watching it at home on your computer screen, it's too easy for you to pause it and go get something to drink, or go to the bathroom, or answer a phone call, or do something on Facebook. It's way too easy to be distracted. You're in a theater, it's dark, and the screen is big enough and the story is big enough that you're really involved with it, you're not going to be wanting to go to the bathroom. You're gonna wait because it means something to stick with it, and you'll miss something if you turn your attention away. Um, so having that communal experience to me is very special, and I insisted on it. It was part of the requirement for the class. But I don't know how you can continue to do that. I mean, the Criterion channel is wonderful, but you're watching it on your computer, or maybe from your computer you can watch it on your TV screen, but it's not the same as with other people. Hearing them laugh, hearing them gasp, hearing them have some kind of reaction that you share or you don't understand, but that speaks to you in a way that tells you more about yourself and about the film itself and what's happening in the film. It really makes a difference, and it's lost if you don't go to the theater. And with COVID and with me getting older and having so many movies in the theaters that I don't particularly want to see, I've lost some of that habit and I mourn that. I'm not happy that that's true. I would say that most of the films I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years I watched on my TV, but basically in my house with my wife or without my wife if it's too upsetting a movie. And as much as I could sit there and appreciate it, I really wish there was somebody I could nudge on the other side of me and say, "Did you see that?" And or just experience in a quiet, passive way, because I'm a great believer in not talking while the movie's playing, and certainly not talking on your cell phone while the movie's playing. That just being with other people makes a difference.
Yeah.
You walk out of that theater and you've all had the same experience. You've all been exposed to the same stimulus, but you may have come away with different experiences because you're taking something different away from it. But it's something you can share.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put and feelingly put. And you do talk about this in your book, and it's an idea on which I wanted to enlarge, but you, I think, preempted me and did so marvelously. I was going to ask you about that difference, that transition that we've seen between, sort of the golden age in which you were having these almost communal and familial experiences at these films that were relatively inexpensive. Of course, at the time, maybe relatively expensive. If $1.50, would have been much more then than it is now.
It was a lot more, and 25 cents was a lot more too.
Sure. Now you could hardly find a quarter anywhere. I can't remember the last time I touched a quarter, but but now it's just absolutely so different, and it's so insular. And like you described, last night, I don't have a television, sadly. I don't have cable. But what I do have is a laptop. So I watched The Searchers, this wonderful film with, all my lights on and, with a laptop computer at the top of which there are how many tabs open as I watch it. So,
And Daniel, let me just say, The Searcher as a Western has this incredibly broad canvas, monumental.
Exactly. And you're just a step ahead of me, and that's precisely what I was going to say. The same with a film like Lawrence of Arabia, or even some of the any of the Westerners, any High Noon or Shane. You have these, but especially in The Searchers, you have these sweeping, panoramic, beautiful images of the West as they traverse through Texas and in the New Mexico territory and up north in search of Scar, the chieftain.
The chief, right.
Right. And my sadness came over me briefly that I was unable, though yes, it is immediately accessible to me for a small fee to rent it on Amazon Prime, as I did with this. But not to be able to see it as really the director probably intended, and as John Wayne would have wanted you to see it on this massive, engrossing, encapsulating screen that in which you were completely immersed, and you could see the plateau and the snow and all these great sets that were built, I'm sure, and then collapsed soon after the completion of the film. So that is a little bit disheartening that I'm unable to do that. And I kind of yearn for a return, like a pre-pandemic return to and a restoration of what we once had. And I don't think that we ever quite will return to that. Do you foresee that happening? Do you think that we'll recapture that communal kind of gravitas of a film being released and everybody going to it and filling the theaters, almost the way that happened with Top Gun, the Maverick film? Was
Mhm.
somewhat, it was like a hint of that. I
Yeah.
don't know if it will continue. Maybe you think it will, but it was a
I don't know.
inspiring hint.
I would like for it to continue. I would, back in the day, the only way you could see The Searchers is if a revival theater showed it.
Yeah.
And if you were lucky and you happened to know about that and you were close enough to the theater, you could go and you'd see it. And it might be a dirty scratch print. In fact, it often was. But it was on a big screen with an audience. Frankly, the dirty scratch print is a problem, and so it would. And what's nice about the streaming services is they're often showing the best version, and Criterion always shows the best version of the film. Also, they're very good at, by the way, of showing like alternative endings and things that are part of the story. But I would think, I know that many universities have film societies and show older films as well as contemporary films, but they show it on a big screen if the university is well off enough, they'll have the best sound systems going, and they'll have comfortable seats. Yale has at least 3 or 4 facilities for showing films and what's great about Yale is that they don't just show films that are on DVDs that are being projected on a screen, but they actually have projectors that can show the old 35 millimeter celluloid films. And they also have something of a library of them that they've accumulated over the years, where they own copies of these movies. And 2 or 3 of them will be available every semester. And so if you pay attention to that, you can probably catch many of the great films on a screen with an audience. You don't have to be going to the university. Many of these things are open to anybody who just happens to live close enough to be able to get there. So the Yale movies are almost always open to the public. And guess what? They don't cost anything. Even better.
Incredible.
So
Yeah.
it's there. It's possible. And every once in a while, based on an anniversary or something, they will bring back a film from the 1930s and the 1950s for a special showing, and pay attention to that. And, I frankly would refuse to see Lawrence of Arabia on my computer screen. I have watched it I have a nice widescreen TV, which, by the way, I don't have TV. All I have is internet, so I can connect to streaming services.
Mm-hmm.
I don't watch television otherwise. And but I also will often attach my computer to my TV screen so I can see what's on the computer on a big enough screen. And in your home, a widescreen TV is a pretty good approximation of being in the theater. What's missing is the 47 other people who you'd like to have sitting with you.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And my fear is that, let's take a child who might be 8 years of age, right?
Mm-hmm.
The age at which you started seeing films. If he's a little bit interested in the theater and in cinema in 2023, he or she might never have that communal experience that is so fundamental to truly appreciating
Mm-hmm.
great works of cinema. And that to me is really disheartening, to know that, yes, I prefer, if the options are never to see Lawrence of Arabia or to see it on a 13-inch MacBook. Of course, you want to watch it in a constrained window,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm just so sad to think that children are coming up in this world that in America especially that probably won't have that rootedness in theater going.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you one example of a film that I saw a couple months ago with my brother-in-law. We were visiting Williamsburg, Virginia, just as on a weekend trip, and totally unexpectedly, we were at a lovely sort of colonial style Marriott, like a vacation club of some sort.
Mhm.
And because it's a vacation club, they had a list of activities, daily activities, nightly activities, in which all the guests could participate. And to our surprise and delight, what was showing that night in their little theater but Casablanca? And
Ah,
I was ecstatic. Of course, it's a film that I've seen previously, at least once, probably twice. But I was like, Chad, my brother-in-law, we just absolutely have to go to this film. So, we went our way, and they do have this little theater under the game room with the pool, the billiards table, and they had stadium seating. Not, it could probably accommodate 20 people or so.
mhm.
We walked in, and every single chair was occupied. And this isn't. I get it. It's colonial Williamsburg, so that maybe the nightlife isn't as active as elsewhere, as
Right.
it might be in Charlottesville or a college, a different town or a city.
Sure.
But I walked in, and it just, I was kind of momentarily overwhelmed with joy to see so many people, 20, but a lot of people cramped in this room with hardly a leg room to watch a film produced and put out so many decades ago, of which people probably have a very, very faint knowledge, but certainly know, with which they don't have any real connection today, aside from a few famous lines. Here's to looking at you, or what
So,
have you.
was the entire audience white-haired?
No, and that is what absolutely floored me. And I live in an area of the world that is mostly white-haired in Southwest Florida. No, and it absolutely was not. I saw, a younger father with two children, probably between the ages of 8 and 10. Couples, 40 years of age, maybe a few elderly people, but not, they weren't disproportionately represented in that setting.
Mhm.
So it was just like this really heartening experience to see, maybe because of lack of better alternatives, but everybody was gathered together. It seemed like everybody was engrossed by this film and was thoroughly enjoying it the same way I did, and have enjoyed it as I've seen it multiple times. And that is what I want everybody to be able to experience. That should be the form, the ideal of a movie viewing experience. And
Right.
I hope in the future, with big hits, maybe it's an Oppenheimer, maybe it's Maverick. I hope films like that are able to entice people back into the theater, away from the comfort of their laptops and their food and their readily accessible everything, and back into that communal experience. Because it's, like, to use a word that I used earlier, it's a little bit religious, where you're gathering together for a very special experience. You're sort of transposed out of yourself. You're in this setting that's kind of transcendent in a way.
Mhm.
And I think that's very special.
That is wonderful. And did you have a sense of being aware of a different experience seeing it on the big screen? Because you said before that you'd seen it on your computer.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Now, this wasn't a massive typical theater screen. It
Sure,
was
sure.
in the basement of a hotel, so it was larger than your television. But absolutely, I mean, you're engrossed by it, and it absolutely changes the viewing experience. I
Yeah.
think it really immerses you. You become much more sensitive and perceptive to what is happening.
Mhm.
My plan this summer, referencing Oppenheimer again, is to
Mhm.
travel up to New Jersey and to watch that in IMAX with my brother-in-law.
Oh,
And
oh, okay. IMAX yet.
right, and that's the way that it was intended. Christopher Nolan
Right.
is filming on these very expensive IMAX cameras, so
Right.
that's
Well, IMAX is the Cinerama of today, and
yes.
it's really very impressive. But you have to know how to use it. And I think Nolan is likely to be somebody who knows how to use it. But I didn't realize that film was going to be available in IMAX. But now you're inspiring me.
Well, I'll have to double check. I'm planning to travel thousands of miles to see it in IMAX. I have to ensure that it is, because
There's
otherwise.
probably an IMAX theater in Florida. No?
Oh, doubtless there is, but my brother-in-law is, he's
Oh, I
he's
see.
he's a cinephile, not in the same way that you are, but he's just an absolute movie enthusiast, what you have is the encyclopedic knowledge of cinema through many decades. Um,
My
so
problem is I know so little about current movies.
well,
But
that's why your wisdom needs to be, celebrated and disseminated, because that's what we're lacking. We have ample supply of, critiques of modern films and modern films in general. What we don't have are very knowledgeable and experienced voices talking thoughtfully and with some erudition
Mhm.
about these past films. Now,
Which
something.
actually brings us to the book that Noah and I are writing.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I think I'm going to need to wind up in a little bit,
Of
but
course.
I would like to point to that, which, my Madness in the Movies book just came out this January, so it's been the one on my mind about that. But at the same time, we've been getting to the finish line with a book that my son and I, Noah, are doing together, and it's called The 12-Hour Film Expert. And
Mhm.
it's built on a book that he had written before, and I think he told you about, called The 12-Hour Art Expert.
Oh, absolutely. I was enamored of that book.
Yeah.
I've recommended it to everybody, and he disclosed that you'd be working on a book similar in its nature to that which he produced,
Yeah.
and I love the idea because this is precisely what we need. So go on and
Well,
tell us more.
not to go into too great depth about it, but Noah was doing something very loving and therapeutic, which was that as I was finishing this Madness of the Movies book, which was a passion project that helped me get through the COVID lockdowns, as I was doing the writing, I suddenly was kind of thinking, my gosh, I've now finished the book and there's nothing else to do, and it's coming out in 6 months, and I really felt a little empty, and I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I was a little bit at sea. And I mentioned that to Noah, and Noah has been very prolific as a book writer, and he said that he avoids that feeling of loss coming at the end of a project that you put a lot of energy into, by always starting the next project, and sometimes starting it before the end of the first one, but certainly at a minimum starting it immediately after the end of the previous one.
Sure.
So he had just come off a very successful reaction to his 12-Hour Art Expert book, which has gotten very good reviews and came out last fall. And he said, why don't we do a book together? And he came up with saying, let's do 12-Hour Film Expert, because my publisher, as he said, is kind of interested in maybe turning this into a series, kind of like the dummy books.
Absolutely, and well, they're not at all dummy.
Well, the dummy books are not dumb. They're very, most of
You're
them are
right. You're
very
right.
smart.
I should check myself. Yes, the dummy books are actually quite sophisticated.
Yeah.
It's-
So if we could come up with sophisticated but engaging and relatively short introductions to subjects that people don't know that much about but are curious about. Noah's art history book was going to be, that was the audience for that. And why don't we do the same with film, knowing my enthusiasm for film, which Noah has since he grew up as my son, he's also an enthusiast of film. And I just thought it was very touching that he would offer that, to do it together, because we'd never written together.
Yeah, and what was that collaborative process like? I know.
Well, we're still in the midst of it. It turned out to be, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag about this, but because Noah has a very important book coming out in December that he was very much involved with finishing up until this past December. It's called Brushed Aside, and it's a history of women in art, and it's likely, I think it's going to get a lot of attention. Great title, Brushed Aside.
I love the title. Yeah, I love the title.
Anyway, because he was finishing that, and the time that I finished my work on the book was a year ago last summer. We came up with the idea of the book. We presented it to the publisher. They fast-tracked the proposal. They said yes. They said, we have one requirement, however, and then we'll be delighted for you to do the book. Noah's name has to go first on the cover. So I had no problem with that at all. And so because Noah was so involved with the book he had a near deadline of, I started writing. And in fact, you ask about collaborating, the first 5 chapters I wrote. And then Noah has now been freed up, and he's been doing his chapters, and so it's the collaboration has been about the idea. We talked a lot about what to include in the various chapters. When it came time to him to do his chapters again, because he was so busy, I provided him with a lot of notes on the chapters that he was going to write, so he didn't have to do quite as much research. So I have to say, I did a lot more work on this book than he has.
I
But
think you need to assert your paternal priority on this and
no,
put your name
way.
first.
No, I am delighted to be in his shadow, and to learn from him, because he's somebody who knows books and he knows publishing, and he's a good writer. He's got a much lighter touch than I have, and so one of the collaborations that will happen. I just finished my last chapter yesterday, and Noah has 2 more chapters to write, and then we're done. But we're not done. Now we have to look at all of the chapters and see if we can find a common voice for them. And I'm going to be asking Noah to zhuzh them up, to use that term that you see on TV a lot, and put his voice in there, because he's better at telling jokes than I am. So
well, I don't. Having interviewed both of you now, having that distinct honor, that might be a very distinct honor. I don't know if anyone else on earth has.
Nobody has yet.
Yeah.
But yes, you
But I would.
are possibly the first.
I would just have to say, based on my small experience with the Charney team, that you might be the more humorous so far.
Well, okay, but anyway, so he's going to be. He has a. The bottom line is, I did a lot of work on my own initially. He's doing a lot of work on his own initially. Then we're putting our heads together, and hopefully our deadline is July 1st, and we're well ahead of that deadline.
Yeah.
But the deadline in publishing is always very porous. And basically, having written all the chapters, the next step is going to be probably trimming them by 25%, so that it meets their criterion, because they wanted this to be a quick and not too expensive book, and therefore not too long a book. But I think it's going to be a great introduction to anyone on the subject we talked about, because it introduces you by genre to the great films of the last 75 years, and what makes a film a Western, what makes a film a horror movie, what makes a film an action film, what do you look for that defines it, how does it work, how do you understand what the film does that makes you excited about what's happening, or makes you scared about what's happening, or makes you curious about what's happening. So that's the kind of thing we talk about, and if anybody is wanting to have somebody guide them toward the best films out there, this book is going to do that.
It's going to be invaluable. And the same way I found the 12-Hour Art Critic to be absolutely essential reading, I'm sure that this will be similarly important and deserving of placement on everybody's bookshelf. I should say, though, it's funny you mentioned the combination, or the putting together of your head and Noah's head. We can't neglect the fact that you are a physician by training. and again, it's funny, because it's a topic that I wanted to address, and talk about at some, but so many other themes were calling us, and we just had to address them and talk about them. And I'm glad that we did. But we shouldn't neglect the fact that, you are a man of science, professionally. That's why I say so diversely talented. You're able to speak with such erudition on all these different topics, and we hardly even probed into psychiatry. But I love the combination of your, maybe, what would it be? Your more right-brained approach, maybe left-brained approach, as a clinician, as someone who's went through the rigors of medical school and residency and fellowship and all these sorts of things. And Noah is this esteemed art historian, specifically of art thievery, and probably more a right-brained individual, right, with all the writing and the professorship and the art. And so it's fascinating to see these two brains combined in this one project. And I'm sure, as a result of that combination, it's just going to be a fabulous book. So I can't wait to get my hands on it, and whenever it's released, probably not July, but
no, July is just when we had to have all the chapters done.
Right, your submission.
There's going to be editing. We have to choose photographs. There's a lot. The earliest it would come out would be a year from fall.
Okay. Well, I eagerly await its release at that time. So
And Daniel, if you wanted at some point for me to come back and we could talk more specifically about the psychiatric aspect of my book, I mean, it is madness at the movies. It's movies, but we're also talking about abnormal psychology. We're talking about mental illness, and I'd be happy to discuss that with you if you want.
I would have you back weekly, but we focused we focused predominantly on the movies side today.
Okay, yeah.
Because again, like that could be explored and endlessly. And of course, then you take the topic of the madness, on which we may have only kind of touched a little bit, and that explores a whole different area. But of course, that is the theme of the book. It's exploring the mental illnesses of all these famous figures, these characters. The De Niro character in
Taxi Driver.
Taxi Driver, for instance, as a prominent example, or Repulsion, the female character who is, well, I don't want to get into it and misspeak now because I'm sure you would open up a whole kettle of fish and we could talk about that for another couple hours. But absolutely, I would be honored to have you back to talk more about the psychiatric end. I just wanted to point out, because we haven't really discussed it, that that is your training and that is your expertise, although I think you're an expert at and of a multitude of things.
Well, the cinema expertise is, I'm an autodidact. I took one course introduced at Columbia, but amazingly the film studies folks at Yale allowed me to teach a course about film. And nobody hollered at me and said you got it wrong. So what can I say?
And I'm sure, like your mother, they have no regrets for having done.
They have no regrets. Well said.
They're very pleased to have had your scholarship and your presence. I
hope so.
Experiencing you, in this format, I'm sad that I didn't have the aptitude nor the wherewithal to attend Yale University. But this book, again, popularizes and makes accessible to everyone this fantastic content, by which I think everybody will be enriched. Mm-hmm. So with that, Dr. Charney, do you have any parting words for our audience?
Watch movies. And and if you want to be inspired by my book, Madness at the Movies, to choose your movies, several of my friends have actually created at-home movie festivals based on the chapters in the book. They, gathering with friends or just a couple, and I agree with you, Daniel. You were suggesting way earlier on that working your way through a lot of these movies might be a little bit emotionally difficult, because some of these movies are pretty intense. But so I wouldn't necessarily recommend anybody binge on these films. But if you want to see some really good films that portray various kinds of mental illnesses, this can be a guide.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, if you find yourself, cringing and hiding your face when watching A Beautiful Mind, then just prepare yourself for a film like Repulsion, of which now I'm a big fan. But you can also, based on the guidance you provide in your book, you can sort of get an assessment of what this film will be like. So Repulsion, for example, is more, it's not like a slasher. When you think of a psych thriller, it's not like, it's very subtle and very beautifully filmed, and Bergman is amazing. And now you've introduced me to Bergman. So of course now I'm, exploring his oeuvre, and I'm loving every minute of it. So Dr. Charney, again, thank you so much for being generous with your time, unnecessarily generous with your time. Again, this is a theme about which we could talk endlessly, and I hope in the future to expand on it after I watch some more films and really familiarize myself with some of the older content available on Criterion Channel and Mubi that I'll be spending some time with. And I just want to thank you again for all the wisdom that you've bestowed on us. And
thank you, Danielle. I've really enjoyed talking with you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so very much. Hopefully, it's been just as interesting as your NPR conversations and your other media conversations from more established professionals.
I will tell you a secret. It has been more. You've done really well. You've tapped into something that's a passion of mine, and I'm really glad to share it.
And I'm so glad to have been able to be the recipient of that and to absorb all this knowledge again that I will run with and make good use of. So to everybody else listening, I thank you so very much. I encourage you to get yourself a copy of Madness at the Movies, again, of which I have a copy, but I'll be sure to post a link of that book in the show notes below. You can check out all of these streaming channels, the Criterion movie, and then, of course, look for the Charney name in the future for Noah's fantastic works, of which I'm a huge fan, and also of Dr. Charney's collaborative efforts in the future. And with that, I bid everyone adieu, farewell, be well from Finneran's Wake.